This talk is called The Aging Factor. It's about design, it's about accessibility, and it's about aging. So my name is Jasmine Orange. This slide is old. It says that I'm a UX designer level 2. I recently have been promoted to senior at EY. I have my undergrad degree in industrial design. And so it is about making physical products. It's like the OG of UX. And then I decided to work for a while and then start working towards my master's degree in human computer interaction. So it's all digital stuff and how our brains work with digital things. So between talking about like the digital products, the physical products, and like spending a lot of my career doing both of those things, I care a lot about it and I love talking about it. I also like talking about the overlap in products. So I'm a really big design nerd. And on top of doing all of those things, I am a full-time human, as many of you are, hopefully. Like, I hope that they're all humans here. But it's full-time. And what I've noticed this far in my life of being a full-time human is that being human is really, really hard. It's tough. And it's constant until it's not, that's really hard. And there's a lot of stuff that you have to consider when you talk about being human. And especially for older populations, they have even more things to consider because their bodies are changing in such different ways. And all of them are interesting, and it's definitely different than what they were like when they were younger, but their bodies are changing. And it's going to be really interesting going forward because the Administration on Aging, they did a study back in 1999, so it's a little dated, but they said that by 2030, which is essentially around the corner, that 20% of our population is going to be 55 and older. And so it's interesting because it's like that many people are going to be 55 and older. That's a large chunk of our population. And you would think that we would be like, oh, we're going to make sure that they're living comfortably, that we're giving them the things that they need. Having that many people be 55 and over should be something that we're all super excited about because that means we're all living longer. That means we have better healthcare, we have better ways of living now. It's not medieval times where you're like, well, I'm 22 and I guess it's over for me. But many of those changes that are happening aren't really being considered when it comes to designing new technology. And so a lot of times technology is leaving elderly people behind. And that may not seem like a big deal right now, mainly because my grandmother who recently passed, she was 95 and she didn't care either way about the internet. She didn't care about it. She didn't know what it was. She didn't care about technology, like cell phones. She was like, why don't they have buttons? What is your thing against buttons? Just like use a regular phone. So it doesn't seem like it'll be a big deal because so many people in that age range have lived their entire lives without internet. Like my grandmother remembers when there was a time before like having electricity in people's houses. And so it doesn't seem like it's going to be a big deal now, but it is going to be a big deal later. And we'll get into why it's going to be a big deal later, but trust me, it's going to be huge. 20% of the population, that's huge. And so what can we do? If we know that that large of a population is going to be older and our current technology isn't doing anything to help any of these people, what is it that we can do as designers and researchers and strategists? What can we do to ensure that we're giving them the life that they deserve? So we can start by looking into what those changes that are happening as we get older. In this particular talk, we're going to be talking about changes in the mind, changes in vision, and then changing in your body overall as you age. And in each section, I'll go over like some things that could help along with that. So the first one, aging and the mind. So what's happening to your brain as you get older? This is going to be actually a pretty large chunk. And it's because this is a very interesting chunk. Also, it's going to be very nerdy. Like I said, I spent a lot of time just like reading on all of this stuff. So if it gets too nerdy, feel free to put it in the chat and be like, oh girl, calm down. So the first thing is this myth about as you age, your intellectual ability starts to decline, right? Like, oh, you're getting older. And so your abilities are starting to go. And I say it's a myth because that's absolutely not true in any way. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite is what's happening. Your age doesn't really dictate you getting older. It doesn't really dictate your intellect in any way. You're actually the exact same level of intelligent as you were when you were like 25. But why are people saying that? Why is that a thing if that's not the case? Well, a couple of things. It has to do with changes in memory, which people think is associated with intellect, which isn't necessarily true. But so there have been a lot of studies that have been done that say, you know, as you get older, your memory starts to go, and that's not actually how that works. There have been studies done that have shown that there's two different kinds of memory here. So there's episodic memory, and then there's semantic memory. Episodic memory is your memory saying that, oh, I remember past events, I remember certain life things that have happened. And then semantic memory is just your general memory of knowledge. So your semantic memory is someone saying, hey, make sure you go and pick up the dog on Tuesday. And so there have been several studies that have shown that while your episodic memory does decline when you get older, so you may not remember something that happened when you were 22, you would remember a general task if someone asked you to do something. And a lot of people don't think that's true because they're like, oh, well, I asked my grandma to do this thing and then she forgot about it. Well, there's this thing called working memory. And a lot of people think your working memory starts to go down, and that's not true either. Your working memory is always garbage. Don't let anyone tell you different. Whether you are 2 or whether you are 92, your working memory cannot hold that much stuff. It's almost a way of saying, this is your short-term memory when handling tasks. Some of you may have heard of the George Miller theory of 7 plus or minus 2, basically saying that human beings can only hold about 7 bits of information when completing a task. And that theory is what ends up informing some of our design principles about how we bucket information on screens, because we don't want to overwhelm people by giving them too much to do at one time. But it turns out even that's not true. This is actually too big of a number for people to remember. Your working memory is around like 4. So 4 tasks at any given time is what your brain can hold. And that's, again, doesn't matter how old you are. And so if we know that, like if we know that the studies are saying something different, where is this idea of us being less intelligent coming from when we're talking about aging? Where is that coming from? Well, the way we conduct our studies matter a lot. Like it matters a ton. One of the things that ends up happening when you're doing a study is that you have different groups, different age groups that are conducting a task. And so you have someone who's 20, someone who's 30, 40, and so on. And so you start to see when they're conducting a task that there's differences in the way that the tasks are being completed. It takes an older person a lot longer. And so then the researcher assumes that that means that that person has bad memory or is losing intelligence. And what's funny is what other studies that have been done have shown that when you have studies that are about intellect in different ages, you also are asking someone to do a physical task too. Now there is changes in the body as you get older about how slowly you're able to do things and how quickly you're able to get something done. It changes a lot. And so when you're pairing intellect with ability to complete a physical task, then it can seem like, oh, it's taking this person too long. And so they must not understand it. So they must not be intelligent. And that's not true. The way you conduct your studies matter a lot. And it also matters how long you conduct the studies. Again, when you talk about these studies and they're talking about these people at different age groups and the changes that they're showing, a lot of these people are only being tested one time. And they found that when you do a longitudinal study, so you use the same participant multiple times. So you use a participant when they're 30, use that participant again when they're 40, use them again when they're 50. Then you start to notice that none of their intellect, there's very little decline, if any, in their intellect at all. But when you're comparing someone, again, who's 20, who can move around really quickly doing stuff, versus someone who's 90, who has to move a little slower, it can seem that something isn't right. Basically, I said all that to say that when people say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, that's not true. It's not true for humans. And fun fact, it's also not true for dogs. I don't know where that came from.
Oh, can I interject with
Yeah.
an anecdote? So my dad's 80 and he had a stroke earlier this year, and all these nurses were telling me, oh, his cognitive function has really declined. It was like giving me anxiety because it was so nerve-wracking. Well, then like when he came home and like I was showing him like this Vietnamese variety show that he really likes to watch, he could name every singer and tell me about their entire singing career from the 50s, because these were like old school like Vietnamese artists. And I was like, oh, okay. And then like recently, English is not his first language, right? But he was reading some poems and then he decided, I want to try to write a poem in English. He made it rhyme. He had the structure down. Like, what the heck? So yeah, just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That same thing with my grandmother. She would casually forget certain things, but then if you did anything that she didn't like, she would immediately remember it, and she would remember it for like a year. And so that happens, and it feels as if when we say things like you can't teach old dogs new tricks, that we're saying that people who are older can't learn. They can't learn anything new, and that's not true. As long as you're able to, at whatever age you are now, as long as you're able to learn now, then you'll be able to learn later. If you have bad memory now, unfortunately, your memory doesn't get better as you get older. It stays the same. So if you have bad memory now, it's going to be bad later. So just prepare for that. I do have friends who have very bad memory. So now that we've learned that you getting older doesn't mean that you are less intellectual. It doesn't mean that you can't ever learn anything. How do we design for an aging mind? Because there is stuff that we still have to consider, like working memory. How do you design for that? So the first thing is simplicity in wording. And it's not because that the people that are older don't understand certain words. It mainly has to do with visual reasons, and we'll get into that next. But also, in general, most people in the United States read at about a 7th grade level anyway. And so keeping it at a simple way when it comes to wording really helps. An example of this is, I used Uber a lot during quarantine, like a whole lot. And so I noticed that when there weren't any delivery people nearby, it would say no more couriers. And I thought to myself, like, who says that? That doesn't feel natural. And then they recently changed it to there's not delivery people nearby. And so even having something that's really simple in wording, that makes it easier for someone to understand the information and move on the task. And if we're already talking about people that are a little slow when it comes to moving around, we need them to be able to understand the thing and then move on. Making things easy and making it intuitive. No one, regardless of age, likes to be confused. And so let's make sure that the things that we're making, the processes and the flows that we're making are things that are easy for everyone to understand. Because again, we have to consider the fact that people are going to be moving a little slower later on, which brings me to the moderate pace thing. If there's something that someone needs to do within 30 seconds, it's going to cause them to panic, like really panic. And then that's going to make it hard for them to focus. And then it's going to make them harder for them to complete that task. And then minimize any non-relevant information. At least for my grandmother, she didn't like wasting any time. And so if there was a whole bunch of stuff on a page, she's not ever going to look at it because she's like, where's the thing I'm looking for? So aging and vision. This one is also pretty interesting when we talk about what's happening to your eyes as you get older. One, your eyes in general, eyes are very strange. They're a weird thing that's happening in the body. But as you get older, there was research that was done in 2014 by a researcher named Kramer, who said that by the time you're 40, you've already started to have like drastic decline in your vision. So if you already are wearing glasses, I'm so sorry, but it's not going to get any better. Sorry, Ying.
I know. Bummer.
Yeah, yeah. So what's happening to your eyes as you age? So a couple of things. There's changes in depth perception. If you know someone who had like 20/20 vision when they were younger, and then as they got older, they started to need glasses so that they can see things closer. Like they have to move everything closer to see them, or at least that's the case with my parents. Difficulty reading small print. There's difficulty in distinguishing color disparities and light sensitivity. As a matter of fact, there was a study that basically says that by the time someone is 60, they can only perceive about 2/3 the same amount of light as someone who's 20. And so a lot of older people have issues when things are too dim, or if there's like not enough contrast there, it makes it a lot harder to see. And that's any old person. It doesn't actually matter. It doesn't take into account things like glaucoma, which is a disease that can cause swelling and pressure in your eye. And that pressure ends up sitting right on the optic nerve, which is where all of your vision actually is. It's all the way in the back. And so for reference, this is what it looks like when you have a healthy eye and then you have peripheral vision loss due to glaucoma. And you normally do end up losing your eyesight right around the peripheral, and then it like gets further lost as the years go on. There's also different things that cause the reverse, where you lose eyesight right in the middle and then you lose it in the outer. And so your eyesight already starts to go down when you get older. And when you have something like glaucoma, that adds on to how stressful and frustrating it is to not be able to see. So how do we design for visual aging? So first thing first, make sure that you have proper contrast between your pages. If you have a light background, a white background, try not to have super light gray text. It's super hard to read, not just for those who are old. It's also really hard to read for most people. Make sure that if you have a black background that you don't use a gray text, because that's also really hard to read. Make your fonts bigger, 16 pixels minimum. Like try to make fonts that people can actually read. We don't need fine print fonts for things that have to be on the page for everyone to know what's going on. And that's also for people who wear glasses, because who wants to like squint? It's going to make your eyes even worse. You might as well just make the fonts bigger for everyone. And then sans serifs are the better fonts for vision. It doesn't seem like it because everyone's like, oh, well, you have the little serif there and that's gonna like help you distinguish each letter, but that actually just makes it a little more complex for someone to see it as they age, but then also if they have dyslexia. A shameless plug to Havana, she just recently had a PowerPoint presentation where she talks about Comic Sans being the better font for people to read. It gets a lot of flack for being ugly, but it's fine. It's fine if you use Comic Sans. There's all kinds out there now. And then we have aging for the body. So it's going to be really interesting to talk about aging for the body, because a lot of what ends up happening in your body is involving your spine. Your spinal discs start to shrink. And again, this isn't including the different diseases that can go along with the issues of the spine. You actually end up just having your spine shrink in general. If you end up having something like arthritis, that's going to add on to that, because about 50% of people who are seniors, 55 and up, have arthritis, and 80% of elders have it. So most people are going to get arthritis, but even if you're one of the lucky people who stretched a ton and you like never got it and you're just still loose in all the limbs, your spine is going to shrink, and that's going to cause you to have shortened posture. It's going to make it harder for you to reach for things, to bend for things, to stretch your body. And that changes how you interact with different items as well. That's going to change how you interact with everything in the world. So what do you do? How do you design for that? Well, if you've ever been in any presentation that I've had, this comes up every time. It is like the holy grail of industrial design. It is the perfect example of designing something for a subset of people and then making it that something that works for everyone. So this is the OXO Good Grip Swivel Peeler. It was designed by Sam Farber. And actually the reason he designed it was because his wife, Betsy, had arthritis and she was complaining about the peeler she was using. She was using one of the old school metal ones. And it was hurting her hand when she was trying to make an apple tart. And then he said, oh, well, we should just make a new one. And so he came up with this version of a peeler where it has this very thick handle. It has ribbing on the side so that if your hands are wet, you'll be able to put pressure there to make sure that your hand doesn't slip. And this became the biggest thing that OXO has ever come out with. And then they started to make Good Grip series of items. And so a lot of their kitchenware ended up having this same ergonomic feel to it, to where you didn't have to grab something so hard in order to hold it. And there wasn't a ton of precision that you needed. You could just hold it and then you could use it. And it was simple and everyone loved it. And now if you go to any kitchen appliance store, you'll notice that a lot of them have some sort of like dupe version of this. Another thing to keep in mind is making your buttons bigger. If you were like me and you were a child during the 2000s flash era of internet, buttons have always been like really, really tiny. And then they kind of got a little bigger. And now for some reason, people are going back to making them really, really tiny. And it drives me up a wall. You need to make sure that your buttons are big enough because there is a precision that goes along with completing a task as well. Back to what we talked about before, if the task is to have two people of different ages click a button at the top of the corner, you have to make sure that the button is big enough because otherwise someone who's older is going to have to take more time to make sure that they're actually hitting the click area on it. And that's not just something that helps people that are older, it also helps people who have tremors, patients who recently had seizures or strokes. And it's just generally a better experience because I don't like having to find where a button is and then like you move your mouse really fast and the next thing you know, the mouse is nowhere near the button. It's frustrating and it's not helpful to anyone involved. An example of this in the physical world, on top of the Good Grip peeler, is the Scion XP 2006. I don't know if any of you remember this car. It had that commercial with the hamsters. It was so weird, right? But it was made for young people because they were like, oh, well, this car has this interesting shape and it's going to be fun and people are going to like it. Young people didn't really enjoy it, but a lot of old people loved it, and they loved it for a lot of different reasons. One, as you can see, there is very large windows, and so that helps with seeing in their peripheral vision. And it's small and it's square and compact, so it makes it easier for people with arthritis or those who are in wheelchairs be able to get in and out of the car without much trouble. It also isn't a hoopty. I was reading online about this car to see what people were saying about it. And they were saying that they like the fact that this car, although it isn't like, it's not clearly like fancy sports car, but it wasn't a hoopty. It wasn't a car that looked like beat up and boring. And so people really like that. People also really enjoyed the inside of the car, right? People like the fact that this car had these very large and simple turn knobs that you're able to use and see even while you're driving. So you'll know where your hand is, you'll be able to turn things without having to look. And again, helpful for the joints. If you are driving a newer car and you have the touch screen in your car, you'll notice that a lot of the buttons in there, the app buttons, are huge. They're massive. And they're massive because it's something that you need to be able to click on without having to physically look at it. But what is lacking is the feeling, the tactical feeling of touching something and moving it around and getting that feedback there. And so that car got a lot of love from old people. They love that car, which I think is great. And it sucks that, like, I don't know if they still have it, but I don't think they do. And I wish that they did. Sans the weird, the really weird commercials, because I didn't get the commercial, but it was strange. So when we talk about designing for older people, for older audiences, why do we have to care about this? Like I mentioned earlier, it's going to seem like it's not that big of a deal right now, but it's going to be a big deal later. And why is it going to be a big deal later? And this is where I'm going to ask some of you to answer in the chat. If you can, before I start revealing answers, what do you think some of the answers to that is? Or you can get off mute, whatever one.
Well, for one, we will get old. And also, I hate having to help with everything.
That's a fair thing. I'm seeing a lot of people say that I'm seeing because of money, that's fair. If 20% of the population is going to be old and you're deciding that you're not going to design for those people, then that's 20% of like the population that you could be selling to. I'm seeing a lot of people say we'll be old one day, which is absolutely true. We will be older sooner than you think. Dignity and aging, that's a really good one too. Being old and having freedom, also super important. So you can't just stuff them all away in a nursing home. That is also true. Mainly because I don't know if any of you have ever been to a nursing home, but they get into some brawls in there. Like, it gets a little spicy. So I don't know if we need more of them in there, because they, like, I've seen them wild out in there. But some of the reasons is, what message are we sending out when we leave them out of these kinds of conversations? There's a documentary on Netflix called Coded Bias, which I implore everyone to watch. And they talk about data. And they say that data is equivalent to just history, because the only way data can exist is because it's taking account of something that already exists. And so if we don't have any data on old people and we're not including them in any of the things that we're doing, it's basically erasing them from the technological history. It's basically saying once you get to like 50, bam, you're gone. It's like it never happened. And that feels very discouraging. That feels really hard to wrap my personal head around of saying, when I turn a certain age, I no longer matter to this field. I no longer matter to technology. And even though for my grandmother, that's not that big of a deal, she didn't really care. And my dad is only passively on the internet. He is 56 and he doesn't care either way about the internet either. He actually just recently found out that there are online games for golf. And so he's been having fun with that. But that doesn't seem like a big deal to him, but it's going to be a big deal to us, because technology isn't really a luxury item anymore, especially if you live in a Western society and you have internet. In the book Trick Mirror by Gia Tolento, she talks about internet as this system that punishes you for not engaging within the system. And so think about things like how you apply for jobs. We just talked about jobs, and the way that if we're able to get jobs right now is by emailing someone who can get you the job, by filling out an online application. Housing applications, those are now done online. Medical care, bills, all done on the internet. Like, so much so that when I get a physical bill in the mail, I'm like, when did you expect me to pay this? When was I going to see this? You know? And so if we're moving everything over to the internet, What are we saying about where people are going to live, where people are allowed to work, where people are allowed to take care of themselves? If we're making it on a medium that says, no, 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 you can't take care of yourself. Everyone else can, though. And I think this one, which was brought up a lot, is that our generation may be the last generation who knows what it's like to not have internet. And it's bigger than just saying, oh, well, my grandmother didn't need internet and my dad doesn't care about internet. A lot of my life has been on the internet. My profession involves me being on the computer. My friend groups I've gained from the internet. And that's not even talking about people whose jobs are professional gamers, which a lot of millennials are credited for making that a really big thing. Streamers, YouTubers, people make their livelihoods on the internet. And for us to say, oh, when you get too old, you can't do this, or even if it's just for leisure, you can't socialize with friends, which especially during quarantine, we're seeing so many old people that are lacking that kind of social interaction because they're not allowed to meet up with their friends, and they also can't talk to them on the internet because they don't know how, like, the internet isn't really helping them socialize. People who play video games as hobbies, when they get older, especially when that arthritis kicks in, it's going to be almost impossible for them to hold those really tiny controllers. It's basically this life that we've built being on the internet, and then it's going to be taken away from us. And I'm not really sure how any of you feel about having that taken away from you, but I don't know what that's going to feel like. And that's going to be really hard. And the only way for us to really combat that now is to make it so that the internet is something that's equitable for everyone right now. And so then it's already in place for it to be equitable for us later. And that is a really important thing to me, because getting old is one of the most natural things a person can do. It's the most human thing that we can do. And it's also involuntary. Like, there's really nothing that we can do about getting older. It's going to happen to all of us. And so I think that that's a really important part of us thinking about what's going to happen to us later, is to realize that we're all going to get old. We're all going to have to go through it, and it should be pleasant. It should be fun. And again, it should be something that's celebrated. It's awesome. And that is it for me as far as my presentation. I do have some time left so that we can ask questions and talk about your other shared experiences. But if you want to find me on the internet, you can find me on most things as Jasmine in UX, on LinkedIn, on Twitter. If you're looking for design related content on Twitter, that's not where I can point you to people who do that, but I don't do that. I'm mainly just talking about nothing. So that's something. And then before we ask questions, I do have a really quick thing, because remember, I talked about your eyes being garbage, right? Let's play a game. So your eyes are garbage. And this is a brief anatomy of the human eye. I couldn't easily wedge this into the conversation, but it's pretty fun. Your eyes are garbage, and here's why. Your eyes, however they were when you were born, are just it. They don't grow, they don't change. It's just your eye, which is why babies have such huge eyes. It's because that is their adult eye. And so if you have issues with your vision, if you have issues with color blindness or full blindness, then you have that same eye, and it never changes. It doesn't in any way improve. And so this is the structure of the eye. And this is a normal eye. And the thing with the normal eye is you are able to see because you have things like cones and rods. And that's what makes your colors, and that's what makes light. So that's what makes you to be able to see, because our vision is just color and light. But there's a portion of the eye, the optic nerve, where you have no cones and you have no rods, you have nothing. And so in that part of your eye, you are blind. It's blind. You see nothing there. And I know what you're thinking. How is that possible? Because I can see stuff right now. Well, it's because your brain is doing all of the work, and it's filling in on the areas where you're not seeing something, because it's like, well, oh, if you see nothing there, then it would freak you out. So I'm just going to make up something. So here is an example of that. So cover your left eye and then stare at the circle, the gray circle. And then as you keep getting closer to the screen, if you need to, or pull back, and then you'll see that the orange dot is just going to disappear. That is where you have a blind spot in your eye. And so there's nothing there. And the reason why you're seeing the gray background there is because your eye is like, oh, I can't see. And your brain's like, it's fine. I don't know what's supposed to be there, but I don't want you to not see anything. So I'm assuming the rest of the area is going to be gray because the surrounding area is gray. So yeah, that's a fun fact. And it's something that has driven me crazy since I started school, is to learn that your eyes are awful. They're just awful. And your brain is doing so much work. So be nice to your brain. Again, your episodic memory isn't great. So don't try to force yourself to do anything. If it's too much, it's okay to take a break. It's okay to not be able to do it all at once. Your brain is already doing a lot, like making sure that you can see. And it works on a whole bunch of different things, BT dubs. So even if you have a very complex background, it'll still fill it in. It doesn't have to be gray. It could be any color. It could be anything. Your brain is just going to be like, I'll just fill it in. So there you go. That is my fun fact. And now I'm officially done. I just wanted to let you all, if I had to live with this fact, all of you have to.
All right, everyone take yourself off mute for a little bit and let's give her a round of applause. Yay!
Yay.
Oh my God, that was so good. Love the biology lesson as well.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Jasmine, or just any anecdotes or anything you want to share? I will say I could relate to so many things that you mentioned, Jasmine, like the simplifying language thing. I wrote like a little caregiving guide to my dad, who is 80. And I wrote the guide because I needed to give it to the caregivers, because the caregivers need a lot of help from us. And one of the things I mentioned in there is like, okay, if you need to ask him something, just simplify it. For example, I gave like lots of examples, like example. Hey, would you rather I put your bed at an incline or a decline? Don't do that. Just say bed up or down. And observing like how people interact with my dad, who is elderly and he is ESL, an ESL speaker. It's like we fluff up our sentences a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially in academia, they do that a lot too. So I'm working on making sure that the things that I talk about are in layman's terms, mainly because it's helpful for everybody, for you to just make it something easy to understand. And again, when you make things complicated, it's going to frustrate people. And my grandma was someone who got very frustrated very early. And so if you overcomplicated things, she'd be like, I'll just do it myself. Never mind. Because you don't want to baby someone, but you also don't want to confuse them.
I really related to that because my grandma, she's Korean, so English isn't her first language, and she's like in her 70s and got her first iPhone. And I remember like I was telling the breakout group that I literally had to handwrite notes for her and describe like tapping the screen as like a physical button almost. And just really use like very because I guess in Korea during that time, like you had to like pay to go to school, so she didn't have a formal education either. So it was really interesting trying to teach where Apple always preaches that they're very simplistic to something that's supposed to be simplistic, that doing like just traditional handwritten notes.
Yeah. My grandmother just didn't get a phone at all. She was like, I have a house phone with buttons, so you can just call that. But I do think that, especially now that people are moving away from house phones, we're almost forcing people to use cell phones. And so if Apple and Android have these phones that don't have buttons, how do we teach people how to use these phones? Because that's the phones of today. We're talking about like in 50 years, who knows what those phones are going to be like, and who knows if they're going to be ergonomic enough to understand. This is not super, this isn't related at all actually, but shout out to Augusta, because I saw a couple of people say that they're from Augusta. I live in Atlanta, but I'm originally from Augusta. Shout out to Augusta. Okay, back to the design thing, sorry.
Questions, stories.
Big thing I learned was like that aging and elderly users kind of encapsulate the best of the design and accessibility principles that we want to execute on in practice.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of overlap. I've been talking a lot about not just this particular topic, but what happens when you exclude certain people from anything. It's interesting because you think that you're just excluding this one subset, but there's so much overlap between our experiences that you end up just ruining experiences for other people too, even if you had no intention on ruining the experiences for them.
That goes back to designing for accessibility, because when you design for accessibility, you don't necessarily understand the benefits that you are creating. It's like when they created the wheelchair ramp or the curb ramp, you know, yes, it was helpful for people in wheelchairs, but like women with strollers or, you know, just different applications that people didn't see until they did that is very applicable.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I have a question. Well, I was just actually, I've been reading a lot about this because of some things that we're working on at my job. And I came across some data from AARP that kind of talked about how people in different age groups use tech. And a lot of people over the age of 70 use computers for like gaming, you know? And so I'm wondering how, you know, a lot of people use mobile phones, like specifically just for messaging, but they use like desktops for learning and just like more practical banking, things like that. So how can we like design knowing that people are kind of flowing between like desktop, tablet, mobile, and keeping these things in mind when we're designing for each of those platforms?
So I think that especially as gaming is changing with like VR sets and things like that, that's also something that you have to think about as designing for these embodied platforms. But I do think that if we're going to talk about gaming in general and aging, that we have to start thinking about what it means to make something ergonomic for someone to use. Because even if you're doing online gaming, like depending on the computer you're using, the mouse you're using is probably garbage. Most of them are garbage to anyone who has to use it for a long period of time, or especially as you get older. But a lot of people, like you said, do like to play them on their desktop. And so I've been looking into designing for video game experiences for older people. I know that some students in Virginia Tech designed a new controller, and so all of the buttons are here and on your thumb, and you're holding it on the side. So I think that the first thing that we'd have to address is ergonomically if it's comfortable for someone to game. And then after dealing with the physical ergonomics of it, then we would get into some of the things that I mentioned about making sure that the tasks that people are doing on these games aren't things that require a ton of working memory, something that's easy to click. It doesn't require you moving your mouse around a ton.
Yeah, I just posted a documentary and they're called Not a Game on Netflix. They look at both sides of like addiction, but also how it's transformed people's lives. And there's companies out there actually creating these giant controllers for like special disabilities and like very unique experiences, because it offers them an opportunity to enter worlds and social spaces that they wouldn't have had the opportunity to enter otherwise. Which was, you start the documentary thinking, oh, wow, this could be really bad. And then you see this complete alternate beauty to these worlds at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. I've heard a lot of, especially when we talk about physical therapy, about using gaming as a way to go through some of the physical exercises and to get a lot of people moving.
I need
Yeah,
that.
that's actually why the Wii, like the original Wii, is they're still like producing games for it because it's in so many retirement homes, like where people can like interact and like exercise without being really mobile.
Mhm.
And I just thought that that was really cool because of also the remote that, you know, they incorporated. It's easy to use.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm hoping, and there's some of that with like the new HBR systems as well. That I will say that the joysticks are not great. And so I think when we're talking about joystick movement, we're probably going to have to change some of that as people get older. But yeah, I like the Wii. I like it in general. It was great for me and my parents to play, and my little sister. And so hopefully we get more things like that that are getting people who are getting older to move around and interact socially, because a lot of the Wii games were very social games.
Is that a
I
part of
would
your like day-to-day job, Jasmine? Like working on the gaming portion?
No, I am just someone who plays a lot of video games, and my partner plays a lot of video games. So it's something that we talk a lot about. He's very concerned about getting older because he's like, "What? How am I gonna play any of it? How am I gonna play WoW?" And I'm like, "I don't know. Yeah, you're gonna have to hang it up."
Oh, wow. I was about to say that would be such an amazing job to be able to focus on that as a like day-to-day thing, but the passion project side of it, it'd be interesting. Anyway, it'd be interesting to follow along if you do anything with it, and if you shared it. I would just be interested to see what you do.
Yeah, that'd be great. This presentation was made off of an academic paper that I submitted last year. So if you want to read the academic paper, I have it.
Nice.
Just send it out to people.
It says it so casually. My academic paper. I love it.
Oh,
That's great. Oh, you know, one thing that I was thinking about when you were talking about this, Jasmine, was like, and I saw this even at my company when we were doing research, like we wanted to make sure our designs were easy to use even for untech savvy people or
mhm.
non-tech savvy people. But we kept, and including me, I'll own up to it, like we kept referring to them as elderly users. But I saw how biased and how like problematic that statement was. It's like that's not what I'm talking about. I need non-tech savvy people, and we did find some people who are in their early 20s who aren't that tech savvy. And I
Yeah.
think Bobby Bishop mentioned here in the chat, I know IT directors and IT leads who are 60 plus. So it's like, I love that you focused on other aspects of aging, like than not necessarily like the tech savviness or lack of that.
Yeah. I always try to make sure that when I'm talking about designing for aging or for disability, that and it's similar to what Lauren was saying, that I talk about how this helps everyone. It's not just some of us who benefit from this. It's something that, if it's designed well, can help everyone in many different scenarios. And even the conversation around, oh, this is important because we're going to get old one day, that is very valid. But another part of it is that if something is really crappy to use for someone who's old, it's going to be crappy for me to use. I'm going to notice that this isn't great. And, you know, I can probably power through it a little more because I have the mobility to, but if something is overbearing for someone who's old, if it's a lot of mental work for them, it's going to be a lot of mental work for anyone else. So
Oh, that's a
making
great
sure that
point.
when we talk about designing for different groups of people, that we're not infantilizing people, that we're not making it like, oh, here I am to help you and your things, you know, it's something that's going to benefit everybody.
Great point.
One thing that I noticed, my mom, I had tried to encourage her to cut the cable and just use Netflix and YouTube TV and stuff like that. And she was just so like against this. She's like 74, and she was just like, she couldn't understand the concept of it, but I know that this is the way that life is going. And so that kind of like makes me a little bit afraid, because like there's probably other people that are just older that it could happen to, where cable will drastically change.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, it is changing a lot. Even my parents, they're in their 50s, and my mom refuses to get rid of cable. And she's like, well, I like the commercials. That means I have time to like go and do something else for like a few minutes. I can go and like heat up my food and then come sit back down. Whereas I think because, and it's not so much as, oh, the age difference is what makes it, oh, I don't like commercials. It's more so that I've gone such a long time without commercials that when I have to see commercials, I get frustrated by them. And so it's not necessarily that these things, the changes that are happening, it just takes some adapting to. And I can understand how, you know, if I spent most of my life having commercials and then now I don't have them, how I'd be like, what the heck is that? Like, what is this? Or, you know, but at least right now people have the option. Like you said, who knows in 50 years if cable's even going to be a thing. People are going to probably cut it off because it's not making as much money, and then you're forcing people into this one mold.
Havana brought up something interesting, and I kind of wanted to kind of say something about that. It's the bias or the perception of an age. Just because somebody's an age doesn't mean that they're going to have a certain set of understanding. And I think that we tend to stereotype, that's the word I'm looking for, tend to stereotype people by age. And it's something that we try to get away from stereotypes in so many other areas, but that's almost the one place where it's still okay to do that. And it doesn't really apply. I noticed this when I went to, I attended the Creative Circus, and, there was a lot of, it's an advertising school. So they talk about advertising. So everything's demographics. How old are they? How old are they? And I'm like, at what point does that not matter? Does that matter for everything? I don't know that it does. And I think we need to start thinking about that, because we don't fit. And I think maybe, 40 years ago, people fit a little bit more into these boxes, but now I don't know that people fit into the boxes like they used to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think really the only time age would come up is if you're designing something specifically for an age group. But if you're not designing it for a specific age group, then I don't really know if you should focus that much on age. If you're designing things that are accessible, then that should work for most people. The only way that the age thing would come up is if you're like, I don't care at all about old people. I'm only going to design for this group and that's it. And that works for things like certain children's TV shows. Sure, like I don't want to watch Paw Patrol with my nieces. But even then they sneak in a couple jokes there for adults, which is great. But, I think that you're right. Having an age bracket for how things are done, it really is. It's changing our research and giving us false data or a lot of impressions about the elderly that isn't true. And then that turns into design decisions. And then that turns into the products that we're pushing out. And again, it's this vicious cycle of like leaving out certain groups of people because the research left out people. And then, yeah.
I was talking to a bartender who's like 30. And his mom is 60 and is an engineer. He has to bring all of his tech stuff to her because he doesn't understand how any of it works. So, sorry.
Oh, I really connect with that too, because so I'm 22, so I grew up Gen Z, where we grew up with the internet. And actually, I think we're overconfident because studies shows that we fall prey to online scams faster than our grandparents. So. Which is really
That's interesting. I never knew that. That's an interesting thing to know. My little sister is Gen Z, and there's even that 6-year difference. It drastically changes how we've interacted on the internet. It drastically changes. And because again, there's a portion of my life that I didn't have the internet that I'm cognizant of, whereas my little sister doesn't remember ever not having the internet. And so her interactions with the internet, her interactions with society are a little different than mine. And so when we get to the point where we have generations of people who are like, I was 2 using an iPad, like, what is that going to look like if they get older and they can no longer interact on the only means that they've been interacting with since they were small children?
That's true. And I have a curiosity because I've seen this trend with Gen Z on YouTube. Like a lot of them are kind of like making a movement. I don't know. I've seen a lot of Gen Z people kind of talking about like, hey, not everything belongs online. Let's stop oversharing. Let's like step away from the screen. But my question is always like, what are they comparing that to? Because like with the millennials, we remember a time before the internet. So I'm wondering like what Gen Zs are comparing that to, like go back to what exactly? I don't understand the answer. I just thought it was really fascinating.
Yeah, I'm noticing a lot of the newer generation are really into like cottage core. They're really into like very vintage things in life and like a time pre-internet and all of these things, which I think is wonderful, because pre-internet was a fun time in its own right, using the encyclopedia to figure out a word as opposed to just looking it up hasn't been great, but you know, that was a part of it. Whereas I think being able to pull away from the internet is something that's very powerful. It's something that is very important for people's mental health. But then we run into this problem of you can't get a job if you're not on the internet. So if there's a way for us to separate that portion and still be able to apply for jobs and apply for social services and all these other things without the internet, then sure, I think that's wonderful. But right now, as it stands, we're forcing people into using the internet, but then we're also not making it easy for people to use the internet. Even when it comes to like COVID vaccinations, it's so hard for people to look those up in any way. And then especially if you're older or you're someone who doesn't use the internet often, how are you even figuring out what's going on? How do you know what's going on if all of our information is on the internet?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we are at time. Do we want to take one more question? This is a great conversation. I love how lively this is.
Got a question. I put it in the chat. I'm sorry, I didn't realize to raise my hand, but I'm curious if Jasmine, and I love this discussion, I thank you for it. Are there certifications or any kind of concentration in designing for aging populations that you're aware of? Does that exist?
I'm not entirely sure. I know that you can get certified for accessibility training, and do different classes on that, which I think is super important and all of us should do. Yeah. But for aging specifically, I haven't found anything. A lot of the things that I know about the aging process and how it relates to design is all stuff that I've looked up either from academic reason or because I just have a lot of time to sit and think about these kinds of things.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah.
Jasmine, maybe that's a course or certificate you can build on a platform somewhere.
In your time, in your free time.
I'll consider it. I'll finish school first and then we'll see if that like destroyed my ability to focus, and then maybe I'll make it.
It's beyond the four tasks or
Oh, absolutely. I think I can only handle 2 tasks at any given time. And neither of them well.
Too funny. Well, we are at time. I know it's late, y'all. Thank you so much. Let's give Jasmine one more round of applause. Yay,
Thanks,
Jasmine, thank you so
everyone.
much. This was fantastic. Thank you so much for coming in. All right, so just as a reminder, our next meetup is going to be October 21st. And the speakers of next month's talk wanted us to send out this survey. It's 3 questions, so not a long survey, but this is going to inform how they will kind of structure the talk and the content. So that's really cool. It's kind of like an interactive portion of it. Anyways, thank you so much. Please come back, and we will see you guys next time. All the co-organizers and speaker, just stay online, and everyone else, we will bid you good night.
See you next time. Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for the great questions. That was awesome.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
That was probably one of the liveliest conversations we've had.